Hey guys, I have another part of my Fountain Pen 101 series of videos for you today. Today I'm going to discuss what nib size you should consider buying when you're thinking about buying your first fountain pen, whether you're new to it or you're not really sure what nib size you should buy. There are a large variety that will vary from manufacturer to manufacturer. Most manufacturers for round nibs, they'll go from extra fine, medium, broad, double broad, triple broad. Then there are specialty nibs that aren't round nibs, such as italic nibs, stub nibs, oblique broad nibs. I kind of went over some of the varieties in my video on the different nibs that are available on fountain pens. But one thing I didn't discuss in that video was what size of nib to get. Now, for me, I believe that what size nib you get is most dictated by how large your handwriting is, in converse, how small your handwriting is. My handwriting isn't exactly the largest handwriting in the world. Unfortunately, I kind of learned how to write with my fingers and not with my entire arm, which most people agree is that writing with your entire arm is the more proper way of writing instead of just writing with your fingers, because you tend to fatigue faster by writing just with your fingers. And when you write with your fingers, generally from what I've seen, your handwriting is a little smaller, just because like if you're writing with just your fingers, you can only make such large of a motion, versus writing with your entire hand, you can make much larger motions. And one thing I've been trying to do is write more with my arm, my forearm, and less with my fingers, and trying to get bigger letters, because in my mind, bigger letters they look better. It's a lot easier to write neater, like not as messy if you write larger, just because your letters don't tend to just crowd up right up against each other. And I'll kind of show you as a demonstration of what I mean in this video. To the left here I have a bunch of my different pens. I'm not sure if they're all in frame. Yes, they are. This is a TWSBI VAC 700 in a fine nib. This is a Lamy Safari in a fine nib, a Lamy 2000 and an extra fine nib, a Pilot Custom 74 in a medium nib, a Parker 21 in a medium nib, and this is a Lamy Safari in a 1.1 italic nib. Like I said, because my handwriting is generally on the smaller size, I write with finer nibs, just because it's just mostly for letter aesthetics. And these are actually, from what I feel, in terms of nib widths, this is the finest to the largest. The italic's a little different because, going one direction, it's a fine line, versus going the other direction, it's a much thicker line. I don't have any pens with broad, double broad, or triple broad nibs, just because my handwriting could never support that type of large width of writing. Maybe I'll pull a marker or something and you can kind of see the difference. Generally markers are pretty wide in their line width. So what I mean by choosing a nib based on your handwriting size. Like I said, my handwriting size is pretty small. I can actually write in 5mm rule. If you're in the US, I believe most of the time wide rule is 8mm, and then college rule is like 6 or 7mm. You might want to check up on that. I'm not exactly sure. What people consider wide rule will vary from different paper manufacturers and where in the world they are. This is Rhodia. I believe this is 6mm. I'm not 100% sure. Definitely not 5, because 5x5 grid Rhodia is much smaller. But because my handwriting is so small, I can write in the 5x5. And I'll just demo my handwriting here for quickly. Yeah, whatever. Don't have to write all of it. Running out of time. I want to keep this video short and it's already pretty long. So you can see here, this is what a fine nib. It's a Bach nib, I believe, which is a German company, I believe. So, the two main differences in nibs widths Invariances is Western and Eastern nibs. Western being companies like Pelican, Schaefer. Twisby is an Asian company which most people may consider an Eastern nib, but they get, they outsource their nibs from other places. For example, Bach, and I think they're using Jowo nibs now. So Western nibs normally run a little on the broader side versus Eastern nibs, they run on the thinner side. So if you get a fine Japanese pilot nib, it'll kind of be the equivalent of an extra fine, like, Pelican nib or whatever. So you can see here, because of my hand, like, fine for me generally works out very well. You can see here that, like, even here on the E, it's a little squished together, but other than that, most of the letters are pretty well defined. They work it, like, you can actually see and make out all the letters relatively clearly, versus if I were to go to a much broader nib, a Parker medium, if I write the same size, oops, I misspelled that. You see that when I write with my regular handwriting, everything kind of jumbles up. Any kind of loops I have to make in E's or A's and whatnot, it all gets bunched up and it's very messy. And when you start writing in cursive, it's even worse. You can barely read that. On the other hand, if you have a very large hand, let's say you fill up 2 lines, or not even 2 lines, you can see the letters, and it works. Like, all the loops are clear and everything. Nothing's really squished together, but it makes it look very unclean. Like, it makes it look very unbalanced, versus if you were to use a broader nib, it would look much more balanced in terms of the letter height to the line width. That's more of a matter of opinion, though. I would feel that if you were writing 2 line widths, you're probably better off with at least a broad nib. I don't believe most people write on an everyday basis that large, so there's that. A lot of people like using stub and italic nibs for everyday writing. I find that because most of the, there are thin lines, obviously if I go in this direction, it's a very thin line, but then when I go 90 degrees to it, it's a much thicker line. When you write small with it, you have the same problem as you do with a broader nib, where letters kind of just start to get crowded up, especially letters like N's and M's, they tend to get crowded. Print, it's not so bad, but once I start writing in script, oops, it gets a little more cramped. So for something in the 1.1 to 1.5 millimeter, I would really consider, if you have like a medium-sized handwriting, that's what you want to get. No one really writes with a 1.9 because it's just not practical for everyday writing. It's more for calligraphy. Another thing you have to consider is how wet and dry the pens write. In this case here, I have a Lamy Safari with a fine nib and a Lamy 2000 with an extra fine nib. Now, just based off of what the nib size is, and considering they're from the same company, you would think that the Lamy Safari would actually write much finer than the Lamy 2000 would write much finer than Lamy Safari, but it actually doesn't, and that's because the Lamy 2000 is a much wetter pen. So if I give you compare line widths, and I'll cross it over like this. You can actually see that the Lamy Safari is in the turquoise ink, and the Lamy 2000 is in diamine sapphire. Both are diamine inks. They react relatively the same to the papers and pens, but the fine actually writes a little narrower than the Lamy 2000 extra fine, and that's just because the extra fine is a much wetter pen, and it puts out a lot more ink, and because of that, the lines will naturally just increase a little bit. And that's why when you use fountain pens with cheap papers, especially if it feathers a lot, it looks really messy. It's because that ink just gets sucked into paper and spreads. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you learned something from it. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. And I'll talk to you guys later.